Hello, everyone. This is Chelsea. I'm the co founder of Immersive Trails, and I'm here to bring you another one of our Small Talk series, which is basically trying to bring awareness about various topics to the general public through short discussions, talks, lectures of various kinds with scholars and others from around the world who are trying to do interesting things. So today we have a very unique and interesting discussion with Professor Crystal Eddins, who is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And her research is on African diaspora consciousness, historical sociology, social movements, Haitian Revolution. And she's coming out with a book soon, which is called Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution Collective Action in the African Diaspora, which sounds really fascinating to me. But today in the talk, she's specifically going to talk about the Haitian Revolution and how women and religion were involved in it. So, with no further ado, I bring her to the floor. So, welcome, Crystal.
Good morning or good evening. Thank you for having me, Chelsea.
Okay. And go ahead.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you about this really important but somewhat elusive topic of women's roles in the Haitian Revolution. One of the reasons for my, fascination and interest in this topic was it started with my interest in the role of Black women and religion in efforts for social change and transformation and revolution. And so I started, exploring other aspects of the African diaspora to learn about these actions. And when I learned about the Haitian Revolution in particular, I was really captivated, not only because it was the most successful slave rebellion in modern history, and not just because of the military genius of men like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, but also because of women like Cécile Fatiman, who was a Mumbo priestess, and I'll talk about her in a little bit. She was a Mumbo voodoo priestess who led the Bois Cayman ceremony 1 week prior to the August 1791 insurrection. And she really embodied my curiosity about women, religion, and revolution. So if you don't mind, if you could bring the slides up, I'll go ahead and get started with my presentation. And I wanted to kind of bring attention to this cover image because even though the archival records about women's participation in the Haitian Revolution is somewhat lacking, there's still a knowledge and understanding among the Haitian people about the centrality and importance of women in Haitian history and contemporary society. So the image that you see there on the right is of a Haitian 10 goud banknote from 2004, which was the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. So this piece of currency prominently features a woman named Sanité Belair. Sanité was executed during the last days of the French expedition to restore slavery in Haiti in 1802, and she was executed alongside her husband, Charles Belair, who was the nephew of the famed revolutionary leader Toussaint Louverture. And Sanité was known for her fearlessness and refusal to be executed the execution. So this banknote kind of is an example of how women in the Haitian Revolution are indeed remembered today, although in ways that might require, unique methods of analysis to comprehend. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so there's a few important things to know about Haiti and its historical significance. Haiti is the western third of the small island of Hispaniola, which I have highlighted within that red circle. Haiti was first inhabited by 5 indigenous Taino kingdoms until Christopher Columbus and Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1490s and incorporated or forced the indigenous population into a brutal labor regime. So many of the Taino indigenous people died due to disease, overwork, and genocide. And the Spanish then quickly replaced them with enslaved Africans to do that labor in gold mining and sugar production. So Haiti was really one of the first places in the Americas to receive enslaved Africans as laborers. And then these Africans quickly staged a revolt in 1590 or 1529, excuse me, 1521, excuse me. So really, this is also the first African revolt in the Americas. The French later arrived in 1697 and brought with them an intensified sugar and coffee industry that relied solely on enslaved labor and made Haiti the wealthiest slave colony in the Americas throughout the 18th century. So as African people were being brought to the island against their will, their numbers swelled to nearly 500,000 in 1789, while the white and mixed race populations were less than 30,000 each. We go to the next slide, please. So the Haitian Revolution began as a slave uprising in 1791 and became the only revolt in modern history, really, to successfully abolish slavery and to overturn French colonialism, with the Haitians then declaring themselves independent from France on January 1st, 1804. So it's largely considered to be an even more radical political event than either the American or French revolutions, neither of which abolished slavery or gave freedom, citizenship, or political rights to people of African descent. So therefore, the Haitian Revolution has become this really important symbol of anti-racist, anti-slavery, and anti-colonial struggle throughout the African diaspora and also, throughout the formerly colonized world. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the archives around Haiti and the Haitian Revolution are largely silent with regard to the perspectives of the enslaved population, but with regard to women's experiences in particular. So we have to kind of remember that most of the remaining records about the transatlantic slave trade, about enslavement in the Americas, and even about the ways that enslaved people tried to resist, all of these records were written by enslavers in account books, slave rosters, runaway slave advertisements, travelers' accounts, and plantation records. So all of these materials were designed to uphold the bureaucratic and managerial dimensions of slavery. And they reflect and are deeply embedded in slave owners and slave traders, their financial interest in slavery, as well as their racist biases and ways of thinking about Black people. So what I want to do in today's talk is to try to figure out or try to discuss some ways that we can kind of fill in the gaps and create a broader picture about what women's experiences were and what their contributions most likely looked like during the revolutionary process. And then if I have time, I'll try to discuss a few women who are noted in some of these archival histories of the Haitian Revolution, the various roles that they played, and then how we can use this knowledge to better understand and center Haitian women today. Next slide, please. So African descended women have a long history of surviving systems that subject them to racial oppression and economic and sexual exploitation. These patterns can be traced to the transatlantic slave trade that forced over 12 million captive Africans to the Americas between the late 15th and late 19th century. Haiti was once the most prosperous colony in the Americas, and over the duration of the slave trade, received nearly 800,000 Africans, approximately 60% of whom were male. Some historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of the newly arrived Africans died within 5 years from starvation, overwork, brutality, and disease. So as the 18th century sugar plantation economy boomed, planters increasingly viewed women as a source of physical and reproductive labor to increase the crop productivity as well as to increase fertility rates. So colonial Haiti's conditions had been so deadly that the enslaved population could not naturally reproduce itself. So plantation owners and traders had to, continually replace these dead laborers with new African-born captives. The transatlantic slave trade flattened and erased ethnic, cultural, religious, and political distinctions and identities among the African captives, reducing them to an expendable pool of labor and source of capital, and a singular kind of racialized identity as the quote-unquote Negro. Right? But similarly, the processes of commodification also reduced African women to their enslaved labor and to their reproductive capacities. So this flattening of their humanity to being singularly thought of as workers and biological reproducers failed to acknowledge their cultural identities, but also fails to acknowledge the robust roles and responsibilities that women held in various pre-colonial African societies, such as healers, as soldiers, as queens and queen mothers, religious leaders, agriculturalists, midwives, and so on and so forth. So women, you can stay on that. I'm still on the previous slide, thanks. So women made up nearly half of colonial Haiti's enslaved population. And African-born women especially were the backbone of the slave-based economy. They were expected to work through their pregnancies and shortly after their pregnancies. They labored alongside men, cutting and processing sugarcane and working in the coffee and indigo plantations. They were oftentimes brutally mistreated, sexually and otherwise. And when they rebelled, they were brutally punished at the whims of plantation owners and managers. So I argue that if we want to understand enslaved women's life ways and the ways that they resisted slavery during and after the Haitian Revolution, we have to begin to interrogate the values, behaviors, and roles that African women embodied in their homelands. And so by uncovering this history, I argue that we can start to piece together the activities that predated the events in Haiti. Because victims of the transatlantic slave trade, they didn't just forget or abandon their African identities, beliefs, and practices once they were brought to the Americas. Rather, they reassembled and reformulated what they knew and did in their homelands. So, for example, in the Dahomey Kingdom at the Bight of Benin, there was a military body of women soldiers who were referred to by outsiders as the Amazons, and you see, you can see one of those women depicted in this image on the left. From as early as the 17th century, these women soldiers served the king of Dahomey as his personal security and also in warfare. Also in the Dahomey Kingdom and other West African societies, women were central politically and religiously. They served as queen mothers who counseled and advised kings and provided spiritual guidance for the kingdom. And in West Central Africa, there were queens like Donna Beatrice and Queen Nzinga, who not only headed their respective kingdoms, but also led movements to oppose the disruptive social, economic, and political forces connected to the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization. And in addition, women also, again, served as these spiritual figures like healers and midwives, and they also did indispensable agricultural work that sustained their communities. So again, looking at this African perspective, I think helps us to better understand the ways that enslaved women in Haiti were central to revolutionary processes as well as to the plantation economy. So now we can go to the next slide. Okay, so there are very few women who appear in the historical archive as revolutionaries, but these figures are probably only, but a few of the masses of women who took up arms or otherwise were active in the struggle for liberation. So we can look to some of the ways that that women translated their cultural and religious knowledge and practices into political power to help facilitate freedom and the revolutionary struggle. So today in Haiti, the main religious system of the vast majority of Haitians and members of the Haitian diaspora, their main religious system is known as Haitian Vodou. And Vodou is a religious system that's based on relationships to West and West Central African spirit forces who at times intervene in human affairs at the behest of its adherents, right? And so women are central figures in Vodou contemporarily. Their priestesses are called mambos, and their presence is very key to the spiritual practice and spiritual efficacy. So historically, enslaved women used their ritual practices or their religious practices and relationships to spirits to enhance the power of the revolutionary masses. The most well-known example of this intersection of African-based religion and revolution is the Bois Caiman ceremony, which was the gathering of rebels that occurred only 1 week before the August 21st uprising. And I just recently learned that August 15th was the date of Indian independence from colonization. And I just thought it was an interesting coincidence that the Bois Caiman ceremony is, some believe that it took place on August 14th, 1791. So it seems that that these events were happening on some of the same dates or around the same time of year. So oral histories and other early sources identified a woman named Cecile Fatiman as a mambo or a voodoo priestess. And she was one of the main presiders during the ceremony that sacralized the Haitian Revolution and brought the sacred authority or the spiritual power for the revolutionaries. And there were other Vodou queens who were active throughout the revolutionary process, such as women like a woman or a girl who is referred to as Princess Amethyst, who accompanied and offered sacred protections to the male rebels. So the 1791 uprising quickly spread throughout the colony, and by 1793, the rebels had freed themselves from bondage and formed a formidable army that had expelled both the Spanish and English forces, prompting the French authorities to issue a general emancipation from slavery. Former slaves were then referred to as cultivators, who were then to be paid for the work, free from violent punishments, and they were also free to buy, sell, and consume the items that they produced. Women remained a core component of the agricultural labor force, as they were expected to help economically sustain the colony during the height of the revolution. But in southern Haiti, women cultivators entered the archival records as labor protesters because they were receiving unequal pay. They were not being paid the same wages as men. And so they were protesting these unfair working conditions and unequal pay by escaping these labor codes or by escaping these plantations or just outright refusing to work. And so this is one example of the ways that women were largely participating in advancing new ideas about work and labor and equality. And then there are other records from southern Haiti about women acting as spies for the revolutionary forces, acting as smugglers, and then also as nurses for the male rebels. So even though women were typically tied to the land and local plantations due to work, surveillance, and family responsibilities, there were some women who were able to navigate the colony's landscape. They were able to secure resources and to, I believe, connect rebel armies across different plantations. So some scholars like Carolyn Fick have argued that women often took temporary leave and used their time to travel across plantations and spread the word and organizational plans for the revolt. So since my book in particular is about enslaved runaway Maroons, I'll discuss two women, Charlotte Papillon and Magdalene, whose partners were both central leaders during the Haitian Revolution, Jean-Francois Papillon and Hyacinthe Ducoudray. Advertisements for both Charlotte and Magdalene suggest that these women escaped their owners in the months leading up to and after the August 1791 revolt, and they may have even helped to organize the revolution. So next slide, please. Okay, so here is an advertisement. This is the type of advertisement that I study in my research. These were advertisements for enslaved runaways, people who had escaped plantations, sometimes for just a few days, sometimes for a few weeks, even a few months at a time. And so slave owners and plantation managers oftentimes would take out an advertisement or publish an advertisement in local newspapers describing that individual or group of individuals who had escaped with the hopes of being able to locate that person and having them return to the plantation. But I use these advertisements to try to better understand the rebels themselves, the runaways themselves, and I try to use the information in these ads to try to understand the perspective of these runaways and what they may have had in their minds or the intentions they may have had in terms of how they were able to use their social networks, how they were able to use their skills, and their knowledge of the colony to try to escape for as long as possible, to try to, carve out a life of freedom on their own terms. So this woman named Magdalene appears in one of these runaway advertisements, and the ad was published on November 13th, 1790. And essentially, it speculates that this woman, Magdalene, that she escaped sometime during the summer of 1790. And it was believed that she was accompanying a man named Hyacinthe, who is kind of alluded to be her lover in this advertisement. It says Hyacinthe was, and other sources demonstrate that Hyacinthe was a ritual leader who in 1792, he was at the head of 15,000 rebels in the Croix du Bouquet area, which is near the capital of Port-au-Prince. So other primary sources indicated that women in Hyacinthe's camp commonly ran errands and exchanged weapons and food. So we see that Magdalene may have been kind of fulfilling this role as a mobilizer and kind of a spy, so to speak, before the Haitian Revolution uprisings began. And also in this advertisement, it suggests that Magdalene transgressed gender norms by dressing in men's clothing, perhaps to disguise herself as a free person, but also to conceal her active participation in helping to organize the uprisings that later occurred in the area that she was in outside of Port-au-Prince. Go to the next slide, please. Okay. And then similarly, this is an advertisement for another woman named Charlotte, a Poulard woman from the Senegambia region of West Africa. And this advertisement for Charlotte was published on August 16th, 1791. Again, this advertisement came out just weeks before the Haitian Revolution uprising began. But this advertisement is saying that Charlotte had actually escaped the Papillon plantation months before in March of 1791. And this was 3.5 years after her partner, Jean-Francois Papillon had also made his escape from the Papillon plantation. So he had escaped in 1787, and then went on to be one of the early leaders of the Haitian Revolution armies. So it was suspected during this time, before the revolution began, it was suspected that Charlotte had been abusing the temporary pass that she was given, and that she was moving about the colony in different quarters. So the Papillon plantation was outside of Cap Francais, which is today Cap Haitian. And that northern region of colonial Haiti was known as one of the wealthier, more prosperous regions because of the number of sugar and coffee plantations in that area. But by the time the advertisement was posted, it was believed that Charlotte was somewhere near the capital city of Port-au-Prince. So, that implies that somehow she was able to travel across several miles, across some mountain ranges, across this really complicated geography in order to make it to the capital city of Port-au-Prince. And we don't know exactly what she was doing between March and August of 1791. We don't necessarily know exactly where she went or with whom she was in contact. But it is possible that she may have left in the spring on behalf of Jean-Francois to help coordinate the rebellions that would then occur a few months later. So while Charlotte was traveling in the greater Port-au-Prince area, there were smaller uprisings that began there in July that anticipated the August mass revolt in the Northern Plain. So then by September, records show that Charlotte was actually back north with Jean-Francois, and that rebels of the Galifet, the former Galifet plantation, had named them king and queen. So this election of kings and queens was common among the rebels whenever they gained a military stronghold of a parish. So in this case, we might think then of Charlotte's crowning as a reward for her role in coordinating the northern and western revolts. So we can go to the next slide. So I want to leave some time for questions. So I won't go through this each one of the points in this slide, but I also wanted to kind of bring attention to the fact that there were other ways that women were participating and contributing to the revolution, even if they were not necessarily directly taking up arms. There were women who were married to military officers. There were women who were mothers to military officers and children as well. And so I want to just try to give some consideration and thought to the idea that the Haitian Revolution, not only were women partaking in it, but it was also an event that was happening to women and children. And there's one story that comes from the archives about a woman who was, from a primary source, about a woman who was executed alongside her daughters during the final French invasion of Haiti to reinstate slavery. And so the story about this woman and her daughters suggests that as they were going to the executioner square, that the mother was trying to, console her daughters and encourage them to quote, rejoice because your wombs will not beget slaves. So this is something that she's saying to her daughters as the three of them are about to be executed. And I kind of look at that phrasing, that your wombs will not beget slaves, as a statement that indicates that this, for her, death meant freedom from slavery itself, but also the freedom from the reproductive labor of bringing new life into this world that was defined by slavery, by violence and death. And so this anecdote kind of reveals how the formerly enslaved women of colonial Haiti viewed the Haitian Revolution. Many of them probably saw it as a source of liberation that would end their realities of slavery and coerced reproduction. So in this case, the risk of sacrificing one's life was worth the ability to regain control over the intimacies of mothering and kinship. So we can go to the next slide, please. So I'll end here just by kind of reiterating that the Haitian Revolution stands as one of the world's monumental struggles against racial slavery and against European colonization. And to reiterate that women were an important part of that struggle. So when we look at distinctly Haitian cultural formations, such as living arrangements and work patterns and Haitian religion, women tend to figure prominently in these spaces. And in today's Haitian vernacular, women are viewed as the potomitan, or the pill, or what is known as the pillar, because they are thought of not just as pillars of the economy, but they're pillars of their families, of their communities, of their religious practice, as well as kind of the pillars and the center of collective efforts for transformational change in Haitian society. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to any of your questions and comments. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. That was really fascinating. So, we don't have that many questions, but I do have some questions of my own. So, I think first I wanted to ask a little bit more about this kinds of sources that you have access to. So, you've shown us some slave advertisements. Um, like some runaway advertisements. So what other kinds of sources did you really look at in the archives or otherwise?
Sure. So the vast majority of the primary sources that I used were these advertisements, and I was able to access the entire run of them from this one particular newspaper, Les Affiches Américaines. There is a online database that has digitized all of these advertisements. So that was the bulk of the sources that I used. Other records that I used came from some of the colonial records that still exist in Aix-en-Provence. So these were just kind of notes or declarations from the royal government, declarations from the colonial government, and then just other primary sources that were written by travelers, that were written by just people who were paying attention to and writing about things that were happening in the colony. People like Moreau de Saint Marie, a priest named Jean-Baptiste Labat, individuals who were, interested in geology, who were interested in plantation slavery, and were kind of observing this society. And so I
Mm.
tried to take pretty much anything that I could kind of get my hands on, and to bring them all together to try to tell a story.
We uh, we completely sympathize with that because that's often what we have to do as well. Did you were you able to find any oral histories that were helpful, especially in terms of the religious aspects, or not? Is it too far back?
That's a good question. There definitely is more information there that I think needs to be tapped into. I spent more time in libraries and archives. I didn't get to do as many like oral history interviews, but I was able to find certain songs that spoke to the colonial period and spoke to the era of enslavement. Um, but the religion itself really is a repository of African history. I'm sorry, the sun is like right in my
It's
eye.
okay.
Um, but the religion itself is a repository. So there are certain spirits and deities that exist within the Haitian Vodou religion that are directly connected to the African experience. So, for example, Mawu and Lisa were two gods that were brought directly from the Dahomey kingdom into colonial Haiti. And in fact, the term Vodou is a Fon term from the Arada peoples of West Africa, and it means spirit. And so some of those connections are very clear and tight, but I think that there are probably others that need more investigation.
Hmm. Okay. Very interesting. And then I was also wondering for the women who were acting as probably some sort of spy or a go between or smugglers or something like that, um, apart from being, black slaves, um, did they use their position in society as women to kind of blend in or go under the radar, do you think? Were you able to find any information about that sort of thing?
I believe there's some mention of women who may have exchanged sex for these weapons or for food and things like that. Um, but for the most part, because Haiti was such a stratified society, you had a large population of free people of color.
Mm,
Um, and this population of free people of color, many of them were descended from not just African women, but also from white Frenchmen. And so many of them were actually quite wealthy. They owned slaves, they owned property, they were well educated. And so free women of color were actually quite entrepreneurial in places like Cap Francais and Port-au-Prince. And so I do believe there were women who ran away and tried to blend into that population.
hmm,
Women and men, really, who sometimes they would take clothes, they would take a pass um, to kind of forge maybe their owner's signature to attest to their freedom. And so I think that was actually one of the more common tactics that runaways used was to try to disguise themselves as a free person of color.
hmm. Okay. So I think let's take a couple of the questions. The first one is from my husband. um, he asks, how many of the slaves were working in indigo plantations? Haiti produced one of the best indigo dyes in the world, which was then boycotted by Europe after the success of the revolution. And then the indigo exploitation started in Bengal, which then caused a bunch of problems here. So, uh, tell us about this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't say that I have a definitive number of the number of folks who were enslaved on indigo plantations. Um, Indigo was the kind of I think the third most productive crop that was produced in Haiti behind sugar and coffee. So the vast majority of the enslaved population would have been on sugar and coffee plantations, and then a smaller number on these smaller indigo plantations. Um, but I think you're completely correct in that it was increasingly being known for Haiti was increasingly being known for indigo cultivation toward the end of the 18th century. Um, but I don't have exact numbers on how many people were on those plantations. But it
Yeah, of
is
course.
important to note that connection between
Mhm,
the fall of indigo production in the Caribbean and then its rise in Asia.
mhm, exactly. So the other one is also from him, I believe. Have you found any reference to slaves from the Indian Ocean Network who were present in Haiti at the time of the revolution?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And I think I mentioned that to Chelsea before we got started. Looking at these runaway advertisements, one of the things that I was able to identify was some of the origins of these captives. So, like I mentioned, the vast majority of African captives of the enslaved population were adults who had been brought from the continent. And so, oftentimes these advertisements do specify that person's ethnic origin, or at least the general region from where they were brought, or the port that they were brought from. And so I was able to identify over 100 origins, or 100 ethnic labels, if you will. But there were among these runaways, but there were also enslaved people who were brought from other parts of the Caribbean, from Spanish colonies, from English speaking colonies like Jamaica, from Curacao. And among those were also indigenous Indians. And so it gets a little complicated because you had, obviously, because Christopher Columbus didn't know where he was, you had the indigenous people being called Indian. And in these advertisements, people were being referred to as Indian. Some of them were, or the vast, I think the majority of those Indians were from the Americas, indigenous to the Americas. But I did find at least one ad of a man who was described as an Indian from Bengal. And it describes, oh man, I probably should have pulled that one up. It describes, his physicality, and it says in the advertisement that he was from Bengal. And so there are other primary sources that talk a little bit about the distinctions, like Moreau de Saint Marie, for example. He talks a little bit about the distinctions that he saw between indigenous people of the West Indies and Indians of Southeast Asia. And so that does kind of speak again to the fact that there were Indian Ocean captives in the Caribbean at that time. I don't have any exact numbers, or more. I don't yet have more information on how and when they arrived, but they were there.
Mhm. Did you get a name for do you remember the name of the person that you found from Bengal, or?
They called him Zamor. I'm gonna look it up real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and actually, if you don't mind, I'll drop the link in the chat to see if this will work for you all. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, there's an online database called Marinage and Saint Domingue, or Marinage dans le Monde Atlantique, and essentially it's a database of advertisements that were published in French colonies. And so the one for the man from the Indian Ocean, I'll just kind of translate or read this one. It says, a Black Indian named Zamor, Zamor, Creole of Bengal, stamped petite. So it describes the branding that he was stamped with. Aged around 25 years old, around 5 feet, having cut hair, has been marooned since the 3rd of this month. And it just kind of gives the names of the people who are like the contact people for the advertisement, for the owner in Mirabelais, or for the lawyer in that area. And then it says, there will be compensation for his return. And this advertisement was dated August 16th, 1783.
Fascinating. The things you find in the archives.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Um, so I think something else that I'd like to discuss a little bit is this concept of marionage, um, which isn't something that in the Indian context we would really talk about. So could you explain a little bit about what it was and how that affected the revolution and just Haitian society in general?
Sure. So the term marronage comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which they used to originally mean "quote unquote" wild beast, but then they applied that term to enslaved Africans who were escaping plantations, and so it really kind of speaks to the ways that Europeans thought about African people at that time. That freedom was a foreign concept. That African people were somehow naturally suited to be enslaved. And so any attempt on their part to free themselves was somehow like this the animalistic impulse. Right? But this term, remained within the lexicon of the Americas. And so the Spanish cimarron was then translated into the French marronage or marron. And then in the Anglophone, they're referred to as maroons. And so throughout the Americas, there have been and in some cases still are communities of former runaways, people who escaped and were able to find safe haven either in the mountains or in densely forested areas, and create their own kind of independent communities outside of the scope of the plantation. Some of the more kind of really well known maroon communities have been in Brazil. In the 17th century, they had a community that I think was almost 10,000 strong. Um, and then in Jamaica, the maroon communities there were known as really fierce fighters, to the extent that they kind of forced the British Empire into developing treaties, so that their freedom and independence could be recognized. And some of those maroon communities, or descendants of those maroons, still live in those communities to this day.
Wow. Um, I'm going to ask a kind of stupid question now. um, how is this related to the concept of marooning, as in if I were marooned on a desert island, something or other?
There's probably a connection. I thought about that recently. I can't really be sure. Um, I mean, I think the idea of kind of taking flight into an uninhabited space, a hiding, a place to hide, a place to find isolation. I think the the parallels might be in those ideas.
Hmm. Okay. So they're probably somewhat related somehow.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, especially if we're thinking about, the ways that these European empires were traveling, and people and ideas and um, language and terminology was circulating from, one place to the other. I think this idea of the maroon has traveled over time and across different contexts.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so I don't have any more questions that I can think of off the top of my head. If anyone else has any questions, then please put it into the chat. But before that, is there anything else that you'd like to add or point out or ask questions to me about our context or anything?
Sure. So I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but in terms of like European colonization and empire in India, what parallels do you see there? I know your husband brought up the question of indigo. Are there other connections that you see between the French Empire in the Americas and colonization in India as well?
Well, there was a very small French colony just north of here, which was essentially one very small city in the middle of Bengal. Uh, so that's an easy comparison, like easy connection to make. But also in terms of the whole slavery angle, Bengal was kind of in the middle of several different slave trades, and so it was kind of a place where um, different kinds of slaves were traded. Um, so one kind would be um, African slaves who would be brought usually from, I think, Eastern Africa to here, um, through very similar methods, but also some of the traders were Indians from Gujarat and other places. So it wasn't something that was just done by Europeans. It was also Indians were trading people. Um, but also another form of slavery that came through here was Southeast Asian slavery, um, much of which was run by the Dutch, who would basically go in and kill all the men and take the women and children as slaves when they were taking over different islands and things. So essentially, they were brought in, and in Calcutta, these two groups of slaves had different roles, which is really fascinating. So you have the African slaves who were considered very good musicians, and also, especially for the French horn, for some reason, um, and also as good guards. So they were used as intimidating looking guards for the wealthy members of the society, both European and local. Um, and then you for the East Asian ones, they were more cooks and things of that sort. So basically, um, they could make European style dishes and things like that because they didn't have the purity rules that Hindus had. So, like Hindus and Muslims had to some extent. So, yeah, that was a really interesting. That right there is an interesting connection because you know slavery was really important, like was a really important thing that happened, and it needs to be more talked about in this context as well as in the Atlantic context.
Right, absolutely.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, so no one else is asking any questions, so I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you very much for coming on and having this great discussion with us. Um, and I hope to see everyone soon for another small talk. Next month, there will be one which I think everyone will be really interested in. I'll give a little bit of a hint. It's has to do with literature and detective work. So that's a hint. Um, so good night to everyone in India, or sorry, yes, good night to everyone in India. Good morning to everyone in the US. And thank you all for listening in.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.